I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now and listen to me. Because I was there. I was standing maybe 12 feet from Ambassador Chen Wei when General Vorak said those words. I saw the general's mandibles spread wide. I saw the bioluminescent patches along his neck flash that deep, territorial crimson. I heard the translator bead in my ear render his speech into something cold and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself. We are the predators. We devour our enemies. We have done so since before your species learned to stand upright, and we will do so long after your bones have turned to dust beneath our feet. And I want to tell you what Ambassador Chen Wei did next. Because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't fear. It wasn't some brave speech about humanity's resilience or our right to exist. It wasn't a threat or a counter-display of military strength, or even that tight-jawed diplomatic silence that says I'm choosing not to respond to this. Ambassador Chen Wei tilted his head slightly to the left, the way he always did when he was genuinely curious about something, and he said, very quietly, very plainly, "Is there somewhere I can set up a grill?" And that's the moment everything changed. Not dramatically, not with explosions or fleet movements or some triumphant musical swell. It changed the way the universe usually changes when humans are involved, slowly at first, and then all at once, and then in a direction nobody saw coming. I'm going to tell you exactly how it happened. Every single detail. Section 2. Set up the station, the summit, the species. Keth 7 was not a beautiful station. I want to be honest about that because most of the official records describe it with terms like an architectural marvel of neutral galactic diplomacy and a testament to cross-species cooperative engineering. Those records were written by people who weren't there or by people who were there and decided to lie about it. Keth 7 was a utilitarian nightmare. It was a Reach-constructed orbital platform, which meant it was built by the Reach, which meant it was built by committee, which meant 12 different species each contributed structural sections based on their own environmental needs, and those sections were then bolted together with what I can only describe as aggressive optimism. The result was a station that smelled like 6 different atmospheres fighting for dominance, where the corridors shifted between gravities, because the Thurvasi section used 1.4 G and the Lenthari section preferred 0.6 G. And you'd walk through a pressure door, and suddenly your knees either thanked you or hated you depending on the direction. The lighting was wrong everywhere. The Vorakan section, where the summit was being held, was lit in near ultraviolet, which was comfortable for them, and gave every human a slow, creeping headache that you didn't notice until hour 3, when you suddenly realized your temples were pounding, and you'd been squinting for 40 minutes. The walls in that section were dark basalt, rough-textured, clearly chosen to evoke something about Vorakan aesthetics that I couldn't identify but which felt instinctively hostile. Like the room itself was watching you. There were 47 beings in that chamber when the summit opened. I know that because I counted them. It's a habit I developed early in my career. Count the exits, count the beings, count the weapons you can see and triple the number for the ones you can't. Old instincts, useful ones. Of those 47, 9 were human. Ambassador Chen Wei, obviously. Tall, lean, late 50s, with that particular quality of stillness that very senior diplomats develop. Not the stillness of someone who stopped moving, but the stillness of someone who's chosen, at every moment, not to. He wore the standard diplomatic corps formal dress, dark gray, minimal insignia, the kind of clothing designed to say nothing aggressive but nothing weak either. Beside him was his aide, Specialist Yolanda Ferreira. 28, sharp eyes, the kind of person who wrote everything down even when she wasn't supposed to. She had a small device clipped to her collar that recorded ambient audio, standard issue, cleared by all parties, a formality everyone performed and nobody trusted. Then there was Commander Hiroshi Tanaka, the security lead. Ex-UNDF, built like someone had decided that the ideal human shape was whatever could absorb the most punishment without falling over. He stood slightly behind and to the right of Chen Wei, which put him directly between the ambassador and the Vorakin delegation at all times. Not aggressive, not obvious, just there. The other 6 humans were support staff, analysts, a xenobiologist named Dr. Priya Acharya who had specifically requested this assignment because she'd spent 11 years studying Vorakin physiology and was, by her own description, absolutely fascinated by apex predators. She'd said that on the shuttle over. I'd thought it was charming then. Later I'd think it was prophetic. And then there were the Vorakin. If you've only seen them in hollows, and most people have, because most people have the good sense not to be in the same room with them voluntarily, the hollows don't do them justice. Not because they make them look worse, because they make them look less. Vorakin are tall. Not impressively tall the way a basketball player is tall, where you notice and then adjust and it becomes normal. They are tall in a way that your nervous system never quite accepts, because height in a predator triggers something very old and very stupid in the human brain, something that is a thing that hunts from above and never fully quiets. General Vorax was the tallest of the 6 strong Vorakin delegation. He stood nearly 8 feet at the shoulder, not the top of his head, which added another foot when the neck crest was fully raised, which it was in that chamber. His coloring was dark purple-black, almost iridescent under the UV lighting, with bioluminescent patches that ran from the jaw down the neck and along the upper torso. Those patches were his tells. Every Vorakin had them. It was their emotional display system, evolutionary honesty, you might call it, since they couldn't easily suppress it. Crimson meant aggression. Gold meant dominance assertion. Blue meant something closer to what humans might call interest, though Vorakin researchers would push back on that translation. He had 6 limbs, the standard Vorakin configuration, 4 lower limbs for locomotion and 2 upper ones for manipulation, with what could loosely be called hands at the ends, except Vorakin hands had 4 fingers arranged in a radial pattern rather than a linear one, and each finger ended in a retractable claw that, when extended, was roughly the length of a human index finger. The claws were pale, almost white. They caught the light. His face, and I use that word knowing it's imprecise, was dominated by a bony cranial ridge that ran front to back and terminated in a crest of hollow, vibrating spines that produced the subsonic frequencies Vorakin used for long-range communication. His eyes were compound, deep amber, and they didn't blink the way human eyes blink. They sort of cycled, membranes sweeping from multiple directions. It was deeply unsettling if you hadn't seen it before, and somewhat unsettling even after you had. His mandibles, the 2 lower jaw structures that humans kept diplomatically ignoring, were spread at approximately 60% extension when he entered the chamber. That was a greeting posture, apparently. It meant something like, I acknowledge your presence and choose not to immediately consume you. The xenobiologists had assured us this was a positive sign. I remember thinking the bar seemed fairly low. Section 3, the opening. The summit had been organized for 6 months. 6 months of preliminary correspondence through the Reach Translation Network. 6 months of protocol negotiations and dietary accommodation discussions and security arrangement compromises, and all the 1,000 other small pieces that have to click into place before you can put a human and a Vorakin general in the same room without someone dying. The Vorakin had wanted the summit because they were expanding, and their expansion route led directly through what humanity called the settled fringe, 17 colony worlds, 11 transit hubs, and an asteroid belt that held more rare earth metals than anything this side of the galactic core. They'd been expanding for 3 centuries, steadily and without much resistance, because most species they encountered were either smaller and weaker, or larger and uninterested. Humanity was neither. This was a problem the Vorakin hadn't entirely anticipated. Not because humans were militarily superior. We weren't, not in a straight fight, not yet. But because when the Vorak and advanced scouts reached the settled fringe and began the standard dominance assessment process, buzzing colony worlds, disrupting transit lanes, the 1,000 little tests that told them what they needed to know about a species' fight-or-flight threshold, what they found confused them. Humans didn't flee. They also didn't mount any particular heroic resistance. They just stayed and watched and started taking notes. The xenobiologists cataloged Vorak and scoutship configurations. The engineers reverse-engineered a transit disruption device from the debris of one that got too close to colony Artemis IV and was shot down by a mining platform's defense system. Not a military response, just automated perimeter protection, the same thing that kept the asteroid miners from colliding with each other. The colonial administrations filed formal complaints through the Reach diplomatic network, with a thoroughness that the Reach described later as almost alarming in its organizational detail. And then humanity sent a ship to the Vorakan home system. Not a military ship, a survey vessel with a crew of 12. Flying under coalition diplomatic flag, with a message that, translated from the Reach standard lingua into Vorakan, apparently meant something along the lines of, "Hello, we have noticed your interest in our territory. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this before things become unnecessarily complicated for both of us." The Vorakan had debated for 11 months about whether to destroy the ship or respond to it. They'd responded. And that was how we ended up on Keth 7. Section 4, First Contact Real Time. The opening ceremonies took about 4 hours, and were largely ceremonial in the way that things are ceremonial when neither party really wants to be doing them, but both parties understand that skipping them would mean something. There was a statement of territorial intentions. There was a formal acknowledgement of species sovereignty under Reach law. There was a very tense 15 minutes when the Vorakan delegation's secondary translator broke, and the backup rendered a Vorakan statement about territorial inheritance as territorial consumption, which produced a moment of complete frozen silence before Dr. Acharya quietly noted to Ambassador Chen Wei that the Vorakan word in question was Kethvral, which could mean either depending on context, and that the contextual markers suggested inheritance, not consumption. Chen Wei had nodded once, made a small note, and continued. It was after the formal statements, during what the agenda called informal exchange period, that General Vorax made his move. The Vorakan style of negotiation, I had been briefed, was built around a concept they called Vreth display, dominance performance. Before any substantive discussion, before any actual negotiation of terms or positions, there was a period in which each party established their position in the relational hierarchy. It was, at its core, an extended exercise in mutual intimidation, designed to determine who would be negotiating from a position of strength and who would be negotiating from submission. Most species, encountering Vorakan for the first time, arrived at submission fairly quickly. General Vorax took his position at the center of the chamber, not behind the table, not in his designated place, but physically at the center of the room, and he let the UV light catch his bioluminescent patches, which were cycling through gold and deep crimson in a pattern I later learned was called Veth collar, the display of the apex. He let the silence hold for almost 30 seconds. Then he spoke. The translator bead rendered it cleanly, without inflection, which was somehow worse than if it had added some. We are Vorakan. We have traveled the stars for 4,000 years. In that time, we have encountered 43 species capable of what you would call civilization. Of those 43, 7 chose to stand against us. They no longer exist. 36 chose to step aside. They serve us still. We are the predators. We devour our enemies. We have done so since before your species learned to stand upright. and we will do so long after your bones have turned to dust beneath our feet." He let that sit. The chamber was very quiet. I was watching the human delegation. Commander Tanaka's expression hadn't changed. He'd mastered the same diplomatic stillness as Chen Wei, though on a face built for confrontation it read differently. Specialist Ferreira was writing something down. Dr. Acharya was looking at General Vorax with an expression I can only describe as the opposite of fear, which is something more interested than excitement and more focused than fascination. And Ambassador Chen Wei tilted his head slightly to the left. He looked at General Vorax for a long moment, not staring him down, not performing some counter-dominance display, just actually looking, the way you look at something you're genuinely trying to understand. And then he said, "Is there somewhere I can set up a grill?" Section 5. Build tension, the room responds. The first thing that happened was silence. Not dramatic, held-breath silence. More like the silence you get when an audio feed drops and everyone's waiting to see if it comes back. A processing pause. The kind of silence that means the universe is figuring out what just happened. General Vorax's bioluminescent patches cycled through 3 colors in fast succession: crimson, then something pale and uncertain that I'd never seen before, then amber, which I'd been told indicated confusion. His mandibles retracted slightly. Not full retraction, that would have been a submission gesture, just partial, the Voracan equivalent of a frown. His secondary, a sleeker Voracan named Subcommander Teth, leaned toward him and made a low subsonic sound, too low for human hearing to catch. But the seismic sensors in the chamber floor registered it, and my earpiece rendered it as. Rephrase inquiry for clarification. Vorax held up one long hand. The gesture, apparently, translates across species, because I recognized it as weight and looked back at Ambassador Chen Wei. "You inquire about a cooking apparatus." Chen Wei spread his hand slightly, open-palmed, peaceful gesture, universal enough. "Yes," he said, "specifically one suited for open-flame grilling. I have approximately 6 kilograms of marinated beef. That's a protein source from our homeworld, and I find that negotiation tends to go considerably better on all sides when everyone's eaten something. I was going to ask before the opening statements, but the timing didn't feel right." He said this the way you might explain that you've forgotten to pick up dry cleaning. Completely, absolutely unperturbed. Dr. Acharya, to her credit, did not smile. She had clearly been anticipating something like this, or perhaps not this exactly, but something in this direction, and she had prepared herself. Specialist Ferreira had stopped writing and was looking at Chen Wei with an expression of professional admiration mixed with mild panic. Commander Tanaka, I noticed, had not changed expression at all. General Vorax took several seconds. "Several more." "You," he said, and the translator struggled briefly with the precise valence of the next word, eventually settling on respond. Respond to the declaration of Voracan dominance, with a request to prepare food. "I'm responding to a long morning with an honest need," Chen Wei said, "and also, yes, a practical question. The declaration was noted. I understand your position. I've read the histories of the 36 species who stepped aside. I'd like to discuss that, all of it, but I've found it's genuinely harder to have a productive conversation when people are hungry and tense. You've been in deep space transit for 11 days. He paused. "I checked your routing. That's a long trip. I imagine your delegation could eat something too." There was a moment. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I don't want to overstate it. There was a moment where something shifted in General Vorax's posture. It was small. It was the kind of small that you only notice if you're watching very carefully, which I was, because it was my job. The neck crest lowered about 4 inches. Not submission, not even close, but something less than full aggression display. Something that, in Voracan body language, occupied a space that didn't have a clean human equivalent. The closest I could come to it later in my report was the posture of an apex predator who has been presented with something unexpected and has chosen to investigate rather than eliminate. Vorakin do not share meals with prey, he said. We're not prey, Chen Wei said, simply, not defiantly, the way you state a physical constant. And I'm not offering you prey food. The beef is for the human delegation. I'd want to know what your delegation eats before I offered you anything, because I'd want to make sure I was offering something appropriate. I was actually hoping your xenobiology team could advise. Another pause. You want to feed us, Vorax said. I want to eat, and I thought it would be rude to do it in front of you without offering something equivalent. Basic courtesy. General Vorax looked at him for a long time. Then he made a sound deep, resonant, subsonic at its base, that the translator rendered after a brief processing delay as, "This species is very strange." Chen Wei smiled. We get that a lot. Section 6, the grill arrives. I want to be clear about something. Ambassador Chen Wei had actually packed a grill. When I say this to people who weren't there, there's usually a pause, similar to the one in the chamber, actually, followed by a question about whether that was planned. And the answer is yes, it was planned. And it was planned in the way that all the best things Chen Wei did were planned. Not as a stunt, not as a performance, but as a genuine, practical decision made by someone who had thought very carefully about human needs, and decided that meeting them honestly was more diplomatically powerful than pretending they didn't exist. The grill was a compact unit, collapsible, designed for the diplomatic core field kit. It ran on a small fuel cell and could reach appropriate cooking temperatures in about 8 minutes. It was not, by any standard, an impressive piece of equipment. It was utilitarian and slightly battered, and it had clearly been used before because there were scorch marks on the grate that hadn't fully cleaned off. Specialist Ferreira retrieved it from the equipment case with the same professional calm she'd have used retrieving a data tablet. She set it up near the observation windows on the far side of the chamber, the side with the best ventilation, because Chen Wei had thought about that too, and connected the fuel cell, and the smell of the heating metal began to drift through the chamber almost immediately. Smells are interesting on a multi-species station. Most species in the Reach have olfactory systems that differ enough from human norms that shared scent experiences are rare. But heat, the smell of something being cooked over open flame, is apparently something that crosses species lines more readily than anyone had expected. Later, Dr. Acharya would explain that thermal processing of proteins produces volatile aromatic compounds that are detectable by most carbon-based life forms, and that in many species, these compounds trigger ancient neurological responses associated with resource identification. In simpler language, a lot of beings across a lot of species have something that responds to the smell of cooking meat. The Vorakin reaction was interesting. They didn't move. They stayed exactly where they were, which was, by that point, seated at their end of the negotiation table. General Vorax had made the transition from standing dominance display to seated acknowledgement, which I'd been told was itself a significant shift. But their neck crests, which had been cycling through various threat display configurations since the summit began, slowly, over about 3 minutes, lowered to what I was told was rest configuration. Subcommander Teth's nostrils, wide, complex, capable of detecting chemical signals over extraordinary distances, were flaring in a slow, rhythmic pattern. General Vorax, for his part, was watching Ambassador Chen Wei with an expression that I'm going to describe as assessing, because I don't have a better word, and because the amber of his eye patches had shifted to something warmer, something that sat between amber and gold without quite being either. Chen Wei removed the beef from a sealed thermal container. It had been marinating since before they left the human transport ship, I know this because Ferreira told me later in the debrief, slightly awed by the forward planning. The marinade was soy-based, the classic. Garlic, ginger, a little sesame. Something Chen Wei had been making since he was a kid. Apparently, a recipe from his grandmother that he'd adapted for space travel, with a minor modification to the garlic content, because fresh garlic didn't hold well in vacuum-sealed pouches. He laid the first pieces on the grill himself. The sound, that immediate, specific sound of cold protein hitting hot metal, filled the chamber. You know that sound. Everyone knows that sound. It's one of those sounds that bypasses your higher reasoning and goes straight to some older place. Something warm. Something that means food and fire and people together. The Vorakin went very still. Not the predator stillness of something preparing to attack. Something different. Something I'd describe, with full acknowledgement that I'm projecting human categories onto non-human beings, as involuntary attention. General Vorax leaned forward approximately 3 inches. He caught himself doing it. He leaned back. His neck crest, which had been at rest configuration, flicked upward, not to full display height, but noticeably, and then came back down. Subcommander Teth said something subsonic. The translator rendered it as, "The proteins are complex, multiple compound chains." Vorax replied, also subsonic. The translator needed a moment, noted. Ambassador Chen Wei turned the first pieces of beef with a small pair of tongs. He didn't look at the Vorakin while he did it. That was deliberate. I understood it was deliberate. Making eye contact while performing a food preparation act would have been, in Vorakin social code, either a challenge or a submission depending on duration and posture, and Chen Wei had done enough reading to know that not watching was the appropriate neutral position. He said conversationally, to the air in general, "My grandmother used to say that there's no conversation you can't start over a shared meal. She'd lived through some fairly significant disagreements in her life. I think she was right." Nobody responded. The beef kept cooking. The smell deepened. After approximately 2 minutes, General Vorax said, in a tone that I can only describe as carefully positioned between inquiry and statement, "Your species uses thermal processing on proteins." "Almost universally," Chen Wei confirmed. "We've been doing it for at least 800,000 years, give or take." "What does it accomplish?" "Breaks down some of the tougher cellular structures, makes more of the nutrients accessible, kills certain pathogens, enhances flavor compounds significantly." He paused. "Also, it makes the house smell good, or the station in this case." Another pause from Vorax. "We do not process," he said. "We consume directly." "I know," Chen Wei said. "Your physiological profile supports it. Your digestive system is considerably more robust than ours. We lose efficiency without processing. We compensate with chemistry. You are aware of our physiology. We've been studying you since your scouts reached the fringe, same as you've been studying us." He turned another piece of beef. "You're genuinely fascinating. 800 years of space travel and you're still essentially apex predator bodied. Most species that develop space travel shift towards sensory and cognitive specialization over time, away from physical. You didn't. That's unusual." The chamber was very quiet again. But it was a different quiet than before. Section 7. Climax, the moment the General ASKS. 40 minutes in, the beef was done. Chen Wei served it simply, no plates in the field style, on a flat piece of heat-resistant material, and the 9 humans ate. It was good beef. I can say that with authority because I was one of the 9 humans. The smell in the chamber had reached something extraordinary by that point. Rich and deep and complex, with the char notes from the grill mixing with the marinade compounds. Dr. Acharya had quietly told me earlier that complex cooked protein aromatic compounds had been shown to trigger reward pathway responses in 7 of the 11 tested non-human species she'd worked with in her career. She seemed to be waiting for something. General Vorax watched the humans eat for about 4 minutes. Then he said something that his own delegation clearly did not expect. He said, "Explain the process." Chen Wei looked up. "The grilling. The entire sequence, from acquisition to consumption." Chen Wei thought for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor, just settled, cross-legged on the basalt tile, beef in hand, which put him about 4 feet below General Vorax's eyeline, and was either the most dangerous thing he'd done all day or the smartest, and possibly both. "The animal is cattle, domesticated about 10,000 years ago. We raise them, slaughter them humanely. That's a whole ethical discussion we've had internally for a long time, still having it, but the standard is painless and quick. Process the meat. This cut is from the hindquarter. It's been marinated, soaked in a compound solution for about 18 hours. Then heated over direct flame to an internal temperature of approximately 60 degrees Celsius. 60 degrees, Vorax repeated it. That is, below body temperature of many metabolically active species. Barely above ours, yes. And this improves the protein. Significantly, want to know the chemistry. Vorax's mandibles did something that the Voracan cultural consultant later told me was the equivalent of a grudging yes. Chen Wei nodded. Maillard reaction. When proteins and sugars are heated together above about 140 degrees Celsius on the surface. That's the char you can see. They undergo a series of chemical reactions that produce hundreds of new aromatic compounds. The interior is cooked at lower temperature, which denatures the proteins, unfolds them, making them easier to digest and releasing bound water. The marinade penetrates the muscle fibers over time and adds another layer of chemical complexity. What you're smelling right now is the product of about 200 distinct chemical reactions happening simultaneously. He took a bite. Completely naturally. Chewed. Swallowed. General Vorax watched this as if it was the most interesting thing he had ever seen in 4,000 years of his species' space travel. Your species developed this complexity to improve resource extraction from proteins. Partly also because it tastes better. We're pleasure-seeking creatures generally. We like food to be enjoyable, not just functional. Pleasure from the act of consumption. From the act of eating together, Chen Wei corrected gently. That's the other component. Communal eating is deeply embedded in our social structures. Family meals, diplomatic meals, celebratory meals, funeral meals. We mark almost every significant social moment with shared food. It's not just nutrition. He paused, seeming to search for the right word. It's how we recognize each other as part of the same group. It's how we establish trust. General Vorax was quiet for a long time. His neck crest had fully lowered. His bioluminescent patches were doing something I hadn't seen before, a slow, pulsing pattern in a color that sat between gold and the pale uncertainty color I'd seen when Chen Wei first asked about the grill. Something in between. Something that the cultural consultant later told me, when I described it, had no direct human equivalent, but that she'd render approximately as the state of an apex predator who has recognized something worthy of being taken seriously. We do not share meals, General Vorax said again, but it was different this time. The first time he'd said it as a fact. This time he said it like he was examining it, looking at it from a new angle. I know, Chen Wei said. That's a significant cultural difference. I'm not suggesting you should. I'm just explaining why I do. Another long pause. Then General Vorax said something that I have thought about almost every day since. He said, your species has been consuming this protein compound by thermal-chemical processing for 800,000 years. At least. And in that time, You have progressed from pre-technological to starfaring. We have, while spending significant portions of your resource hours on this, on food preparation, on communal eating, on the social dimensions of consumption. We have, and you find this efficient. Ambassador Chen Wei smiled. It was a real smile, not a diplomatic smile, not a performance smile, something genuine, a little tired, a little warm. General Vorax, he said, we found something better than efficient. We found something that kept us together long enough to become dangerous. The chamber was completely silent. I remember the smell of the cooling grill, the sound of the station's environmental systems cycling, the faint vibration of the orbital mechanics beneath the station floor. General Vorax looked at Ambassador Chen Wei for a very long time. Then he said, "Tell me more about this Maillard reaction." Section 8, Resolution: What happened after? The summit continued for 3 more days. I'm not going to pretend that Chen Wei's grill solved everything. It didn't. The territorial negotiations were complex and painful, and required 3 separate follow-up summits and 18 months of detailed framework discussions before anything was formally agreed. There were moments, several of them, that came close to breaking down completely. But something changed in that chamber. I saw it change. The formal record shows that the second session of the summit, the following morning, began with a Voracan delegation request that was unusual enough to make the official minutes. General Vorax's aides submitted a formal inquiry through the summit protocols asking for the chemical composition of the marinade compound Ambassador Chen Wei had used on the beef proteins the previous day. For the xenobiology record, they said. Dr. Acharya, who was practically vibrating with professional delight, provided it in full. By the end of the second day, Subcommander Teth had asked whether the Maillard reaction could theoretically be applied to other protein sources. By the end of the third day, one of the Voracan delegation's junior members, a young one, probably the equivalent of mid-20s, whose neck crest hadn't fully developed yet, had asked, very quietly, through a translator, whether the grill was something humans had always had or whether it had been invented. Chen Wei had told him, invented. A long time ago, by accident probably, the way most of the best things humans have were invented. Someone kept fire because it was warm, and then someone discovered that things left near the fire became different, and then someone somewhere made that discovery into something deliberate. The young Voracan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, subsonic but caught by the chamber sensors, "We have never had fire." And Chen Wei said, "I know, your homeworld's atmosphere doesn't support it. It's one of the things that makes you remarkable that you developed your civilization without it. We needed it. It was foundational for us. Fire and cooking and eating together are all part of the same thread." And this thread, the young Voracan said, slowly, working through the concept, produced a species capable of star travel. Among other things. The young Voracan looked at the now cold grill for a long moment. "Then it is not weakness," he said. And Chen Wei said, "No. It never was." Section 9, Ending. I wrote my formal observers report 2 weeks after the Keth 7 summit. It runs to about 40 pages and is full of technical diplomatic language and carefully measured analysis of the session outcomes and recommendations for follow-up negotiation strategies. It's a thorough document, professional, properly calibrated. But the moment I think about when I think about Keth 7, the moment that sits with me when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning with the station's hum around me, isn't in that report. It's the moment Chen Wei set the first piece of beef on the grill. That specific moment, the hiss of it hitting hot metal, the way the smell began to build. The way General Vorax, 8 feet of apex predator, 4,000 years of galactic conquest behind him, completely certain of his species' dominance and destiny, leaned forward those 3 inches. He didn't know he was doing it. That's what matters. He didn't perform interest. He didn't choose to be curious. His body responded to something older and deeper than strategy, and for 3 inches, the most decorated general in Vorakan military history was just a living creature, drawn toward warmth and food and something that smelled like resources. Just like us. Ambassador Chen Wei told me, in a private conversation on the shuttle back to the human transport ship, that he'd been thinking about that moment for months before the summit. Not the grill specifically, he decided on the grill about 6 weeks out, but the principle. The question he'd been sitting with since the Vorakan scouts first reached the fringe. What does a species with 4,000 years of successful predation fear? He'd asked himself. Not power, they'd seen power, they'd defeated power. Not cleverness, they'd encountered clever species. 7 of them had stood against the Vorakan, and none of them existed anymore. The answer, he'd decided, was this. A species with 4,000 years of successful predation fears something it cannot categorize, something that doesn't fit into prey or rival, something that does not respond according to established patterns. A species that responds to an apex dominance display, Chen Wei said. By asking where they can set up a grill, that's not prey behavior. That's not rival behavior. That's something they'd never encountered before. He paused. He looked out the viewport at the stars. And curious predators don't attack, they investigate. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother was right, by the way. You really can start any conversation over a shared meal." I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. The Keth 7 Accord, formally ratified 14 months later, established a joint-use corridor through the settled fringe, and initiated the first cross-species scientific exchange program in Vorakan recorded history. General Vorax served as the Vorakan signatory. Ambassador Chen Wei served as the human signatory. At the signing ceremony, by Vorakan request, a grill was present. The marinade recipe is classified. Part 2, the General's Second Hunger. Document style, personal testimony. Recorded by Commander Hiroshi Tanaka, UNDF Security Division, RET. Occasion, Keth 7 Memorial Lecture Series, Year 3. Venue, New Shanghai Diplomatic Academy, Earth. Note, the following is Commander Tanaka's unedited personal account, transcribed from the lecture recording. All opinions are his own. Section 1, Hook. People always ask me about the grill. They ask me because I was standing right there. Because I'm in 3 of the official photographs from the summit, you can see me in the background, slightly out of focus, which is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Because I have the kind of face that suggests I've been in rooms where things happened, which I have been, and because people have read Marin Solis' account and they want the security perspective. I'm going to give you that. But I'm also going to give you something Marin didn't include in her report, because it happened later, much later, during the second summit, which most people don't know much about because the diplomatic teams decided, for good reasons I won't argue with, that keeping it quiet was the appropriate call. The second summit is where it got complicated. The first summit, the one with the grill, the one that's in the official record, the one that Marin covered so well that her account is now taught in 3 different diplomatic academies, that one was almost simple in retrospect. Chen Wei did something counterintuitive and it worked. Vorax was surprised and it opened a door. The second summit is where something walked through that door. And I mean that both ways. Section 2, set up 14 months later. 14 months after Keth 7, General Vorax came to Earth. Not officially, not with a diplomatic fleet or a formal arrival protocol or any of the pageantry that the first summit had required. He came on a small vessel, by Vorakan standards, equivalent to what we'd call a diplomatic courier ship, with a crew of 9 and Sub-Commander Teth and 2 xenobiologists, and one being who was introduced to us as a cultural assessor, and who spent the entire visit writing in a notation system I'd never seen before. The request had come through the Reach network 3 weeks earlier. General Vorax of the Vorakan Dominion requests a private meeting with Ambassador Chen Wei of the Human Coalition at a location of the ambassador's choosing for the purpose of continued diplomatic exchange. The diplomatic teams had spent those 3 weeks arguing about what private meeting meant and what continued diplomatic exchange meant, and whether accepting the request would set precedent, and whether declining it would damage the accord negotiations that were still ongoing, and whether there was a security risk in having a Vorakan general on Earth, and approximately 1,400 other questions that were all legitimate and all important and all beside the point. Which was that Chen Wei had said yes immediately, and the arguing was therefore academic. My job was to make the meeting happen safely. Chen Wei told me where he wanted to meet. I will admit I pushed back. Your backyard, I said. My backyard, he confirmed. The backyard of your private residence. I have good outdoor space and good ventilation. You want to meet a Vorakan general in your backyard. I want to cook for him, or near him, and I can't do that on a station or in a conference room with proper atmospheric controls. I looked at him for a long time. I said, is the grill happening again? He said, Hiroshi. A better grill is happening. Section 3, the day before. Chen Wei's residence was in a city near the coast. I'm not going to name it, because some of the security arrangements are still technically classified, and the backyard was, as he'd said, genuinely good outdoor space. About 200 square meters, partly covered by an old wooden structure he'd built himself, backing onto a section of public green space that we were able to secure without too much visible effort. The 3 weeks before Vorax's arrival were, from a security standpoint, a comprehensive nightmare. Not because of threats, we had no intelligence suggesting hostile intent from any party, but because of logistics. Because an 8-foot apex predator with a neck crest that added another foot was going to be present in a residential backyard on Earth, and every protocol I had for securing a location assumed human dimensions and human sensory ranges, and Vorakan sensory ranges were considerably beyond human in every direction except color vision, where we actually had a marginal edge. I rebuilt the security perimeter 3 times. I had a conversation with the Vorakan security team. Teth had 2 bodyguards who didn't speak in any translator-audible range. They communicated exclusively in subsonic. That was genuinely one of the more surreal professional experiences of my life. We established protocols. We talked about weapons. No one carried any, by mutual agreement, except my sidearm, which I kept concealed, because it was my job and Chen Wei hadn't told me not to. We talked about response procedures in the unlikely event of a medical incident. We talked about media containment, which was a concern because a Vorakan diplomatic vessel entering Earth orbital space was not a thing that went unnoticed, and the diplomatic teams were managing a cover story about a routine accord verification flight. By the day before the meeting, I had a security plan I was reasonably comfortable with. And then Chen Wei showed me what he was planning to cook. That's a lot of food, I said. It's a lot of beings. There's a whole pig. Half a pig. I couldn't source a full one on short notice. What are you planning to tell General Vorax about the pig? That it's a Scrofa domesticus, a separate domestication event from the cattle, different flavor profile, higher fat content, excellent for long, slow cooking. I looked at the half pig. I looked at Chen Wei. I said, are you going to be okay if he asks to watch you prepare it? Chen Wei said, I hope he does. Section 4. Build tension. VORRAX arrives. Vorex's shuttle set down on the secured pad at 900. I'd seen him on Keth 7, obviously, but seeing an 8-foot apex predator in an orbital station's UV-lit chamber is different from seeing one step out of a landing craft onto a sunlit Earth morning. Different in a way that I wasn't fully prepared for. Sunlight does something to Vorekin bioluminescent patches. On Keth 7, under UV, they'd been vivid but controlled, deliberate displays. Under direct sol-spectrum sunlight, they became something else. Something involuntary almost. The patterns shifted with the light, catching the spectrum in ways that produced colors that didn't entirely map to what I'd seen before. The neck crest in sunlight had a different quality. The hollow spines caught the morning light and scattered it in a way that was, if I'm being completely honest, extraordinary to look at. Vorex stepped off the landing craft and stopped. He stood there for about 15 seconds, completely still. Sub-Commander Teth stepped out behind him and stopped too, though with a more visible conscious choice quality to it. The xenobiologists followed. The cultural assessor followed, writing immediately. I had my earpiece in. Teth's translator function was active. I heard the sub-commander say quietly, "Atmosphere is acceptable. Gravity is lower than briefed. Light spectrum is unusual." Vorex said nothing. He was looking at the sky. Not scanning it for threats. Looking at it the way you look at something that is different from what you expected, in a way that is not bad, just genuinely different. The sky was clear that morning, deep blue with a few high cirrus clouds. The sun was about 45 degrees above the eastern horizon. The air had that quality that coastal air sometimes has in the early part of the day, salt-edged and clean. I don't know what Vorekin skies look like. I've never been to the Vorekin homeworld, and I doubt I ever will. I know their star is different from ours, redder, cooler, producing a different light quality. I know their atmosphere has a different gas composition, that their world smells nothing like Earth, that the humidity and pressure and every sensory input they'd grown up with would be entirely unlike what surrounded them now. After about 15 seconds, Vorex said something subsonic. Teth translated, for my benefit I think. The general says the light is warmer than expected. I said, "Welcome to Earth, General." Vorex looked at me with those amber compound eyes. He said, "You are the security commander from Keth 7. "Yes, sir." "You did not speak at Keth 7. "No, sir." "Not my place, too." He looked at me for another moment. "Then the Ambassador Chen is here." "In the back of the residence, sir. He asks me to bring you through." We walked through the house. I want to describe that because it was a thing that happened, and it was strange in a specific way. A Vorekin general walking through a human house. Through the kitchen which smelled of the morning's preparation, garlic and citrus and smoke from the preheating grill outside, and coffee because Chen Wei had been up since 5 through the back corridor. Past the photographs on the wall, I saw Teth clock them, quick and analytical, past the coat hooks and the boots by the back door, through the doorway and out into the backyard. The house was not built for Vorekin dimensions. General Vorex had to angle his neck crest to get through 3 of the doorways. He did this without comment, without visible frustration, with a kind of careful physical precision that I hadn't expected. The cultural assessor stopped at every photograph in the corridor and spent approximately 45 seconds writing about each one. I didn't ask. Chen Wei was at the grill when we came through the back door. He was wearing an apron, a real one, the canvas kind with pockets for tools, and he had a pair of tongs in his right hand and a cup of tea balanced on the edge of the grill's side shelf, which was slightly precarious but very much him. He'd lit the grill about 2 hours earlier, for the slow sections, and the smoke from the hickory wood chips he'd added to the fuel system curled up through the morning air in long, lazy columns. He looked up when we came out. He said, "General Vorex, good morning, I'm glad you came." Vorax stopped at the edge of the paved area. He looked at the grill. He looked at the long preparation table beside it, which held the half-pig prepped and seasoned overnight, along with several other things I recognized from the morning's work. A tray of marinated vegetables, 2 prepared fish, a large pot of something slow cooking over a separate, smaller burner, several items I didn't recognize that Chen Wei had apparently sourced from somewhere exotic. The general was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You have been preparing this since before our arrival." "Since 5 this morning," Chen Wei confirmed. "The pork needs 8 to 10 hours at low temperature. I started it at 6. 8 to 10 hours of preparation. For one meal, yes." Vorax processed this. "At Keth 7, you described food preparation as," he paused, working through his notes apparently, because the translator rendered a brief gap, "as a social connector, a trust mechanism." "Something like that. You have invested 8 hours of preparation in this meeting." "I have. To indicate trust. To demonstrate it," Chen Wei said, "which is different from indicating it." Another long pause from Vorax. "Then show me what you are doing." Section 5, the lesson. What followed was, I've been trying to find the right word for a long time, and I keep coming back to extraordinary, which is too broad. What followed was specific. General Vorax, Supreme Military Commander of the Voracan Dominion's 3rd Expansion Fleet, stood beside a backyard grill on Earth and watched Ambassador Chen Wei teach him how to cook. Not in a lecture format, not with technical documentation or chemical breakdowns, though those came up naturally. In the way you teach someone to cook when you're actually cooking, by doing it, and narrating what you're doing and why, and watching their hands to see when they understand something, and when they need a different explanation. Chen Wei explained the difference between direct and indirect heat, and why the pork needed indirect heat for most of its cooking time. He explained the role of fat in flavor development, and why different animals had different fat compositions, and what that meant for technique. He explained basting, the process of applying liquid to the surface of cooking meat at intervals, and the theory behind it, and demonstrated it with a long-handled brush. He explained the smoke. The smoke was the thing that caught Vorax's attention most completely. "The wood adds compounds to the cooking process," Vorax said. "Smoke is essentially a complex aerosol of partially combusted organic compounds. When those compounds contact the protein surface, they bind to the molecular structure and become part of the flavor. Different woods produce different compound profiles. Hickory," he touched the chips in the smoker chamber, "is high in syringol and guaiacol. They produce a strong, deep smoke flavor. Applewood would give you something sweeter. Mesquite sharper. The choice of wood is a flavor decision." Vorax looked at the hickory chips for a long moment. "You have developed a taxonomy of combustion materials based on their flavor contribution. A very large one. Regional variations, too. What's traditional in the southeastern parts of our North American continent is different from what they use in other regions. The debates about which wood is best for which protein are genuinely heated." "Heated," Vorax repeated. "That was unintentional, but yes." Something happened in Vorax's expression that the cultural assessor caught and wrote about extensively. I know because that document became part of the xenobiological record, and I've read it. What the assessor described was a Voracan expression pattern that had no military or diplomatic context in their records. Something they filed under a new category, which translated approximately as the expression of an apex predator encountering a form of complexity it had not previously considered worthy of a predator. In human terms, General Vorax was charmed. Not weakened, not disarmed in any military sense, something deeper and more personal. He was encountering a civilization that had spent 800,000 years thinking carefully, passionately, creatively, about how to feed itself. and discovering that this was, in fact, an extraordinary form of intelligence. Section 6. The Conversation. At around noon, the pork was at the point where Chen Wei declared it needed another 4 hours of resting low heat, and he moved to the direct grill section of the cooking and invited everyone to sit. Everyone included 9 humans, Chen Wei, myself, Specialist Ferreira, Dr. Acharya, 4 others, and the 9 Vorakin, including Vorax and Teth, the 2 security who sat at the furthest edge of the seating area but sat, and the 4 scientists and the cultural assessor. The seating arrangement was ad hoc. Lawn chairs for the humans, some custom equipment the Vorakin had brought for their own comfort, that was essentially a low platform at a height that worked for their physiology. Nobody had designed this seating arrangement. It had just happened. Chen Wei grilled vegetables. He grilled 2 large fish, from a coastal region locally sourced. He'd been very precise about this, with a citrus marinade and a herb crust. He made rice, which he explained was a grain staple that constituted the primary caloric base for a significant portion of human civilization throughout history. He made several other things, and explained each one, and the Vorik and xenobiologists asked questions about each one that were the kind of questions you ask when you're genuinely trying to understand something, not when you're performing diplomatic interest. And at some point during all of this, I can't pinpoint the exact moment, which I think is appropriate, the conversation stopped being about food. It became about everything that food had been attached to. It became about history, about how humans had moved across their planet following protein sources, and how that movement had produced civilizational collisions that were sometimes catastrophic and sometimes generative, and almost always both. About how trade routes had formed along the paths of spice commerce, and how those routes had connected cultures that would otherwise never have met. About how famines had reshaped political structures. About how the need to feed people had driven agricultural innovation, and agricultural innovation had driven population growth, and population growth had driven everything else. About how humans had gone to space, in the end, partly because they'd run out of convenient arable land. About how the first thing human crews did on long deep space missions, this was Ferreira speaking up for one of the first times, was establish a meal rotation. Who cooked on which day, what they cooked, how they recreated familiar foods in unfamiliar conditions, because the social function of the familiar meal was, in isolation and displacement, more important than ever. About how the single most common item found in every human archaeological record from every inhabited region of Earth across every period of recorded history was a cooking hearth. Vorax listened to all of this. He didn't interrupt. He asked questions at intervals, careful, specific questions, the kind that told you he was integrating each answer before asking the next. At some point, he said, "Of the 7 species that stood against the Vorakin in your awareness, do you know what became of them?" Chen Wei said he knew from the general record. "They are gone," Vorax said. "All 7, this is historical fact. Not pride, just fact. They stood and they were consumed." "I know. You do not ask why we consumed them, rather than negotiating. I assumed you'd tell me when you were ready." Vorax was quiet for a moment. "Then they displayed, as we display. They showed strength and threat posture and territorial assertion. Standard relational hierarchy protocol. We responded in kind. The hierarchy resolved. In your favor." "Yes. And what did we do differently?" Vorax looked at the grill. He looked at the half-pig, which was producing extraordinary amounts of fragrant smoke into the midday air. He looked at Chen Wei. "You did not display," he said slowly. "You fed, you offered. You demonstrated investment in the interaction, rather than dominance within it. Is that strange to you?" "It is unprecedented in my species' experience." Chen Wei nodded. We've been doing it for 800,000 years, he said. It's how we've survived. We're not the strongest species our planet ever produced. We're not the fastest. We're not the most naturally armored. We survived because we figured out how to be together, how to make being together worth something to everyone involved. Food was how we practiced that. Vorex was quiet for a long time. Then, General. Chen Wei paused. My rank, Vorex said. I am a general, I have fought, I have won. I have, what is your word, I have devoured. I have directed the consuming of 7 civilizations over the course of my military career. I was honoring the Vorakan way when I made that declaration at Keth 7. I know. I believed it was correct, that the strong consume and the weak are consumed, that this is the natural law of the universe. He stopped. You are telling me with this, he gestured, a wide gesture that took in the grill and the food and the backyard, and somehow I felt something larger than all of them, that there is another law, that there are other ways to survive. Chen Wei looked at him. I'm telling you there's another way to thrive, he said. Surviving is the minimum. Thriving is the thing worth aiming for. And we found that you thrive longer and better and in more interesting directions when you bring people along instead of consuming them. The general was very still. His neck crest was fully down. His bioluminescent patches were doing that between gold and something else pattern again. He said, very quietly, I am beginning to understand why your species is so difficult to classify. Section 7, the pork is done. At 6 in the evening, Chen Wei declared the pork done. He'd been checking it at intervals throughout the afternoon, temperature, texture, color, with the same methodical attention I'd watched him apply to everything else in the preparation. When he finally lifted the long section of meat from the grill and rested it on the carving surface, the smell that rose from it was something I don't have adequate language for. The Vorakan delegation went very still. All 9 of them. The 2 security, who'd spent most of the day in careful professional stillness, both leaned forward. The cultural assessor stopped writing. Subcommander Teth's nostrils were cycling at about twice the rate they'd been earlier. And General Vorax, an 8-foot apex predator, 4,000 years of galactic conquest, the being who had stood in an orbital station chamber and declared his species' dominion over all they surveyed, General Vorax inhaled slowly, deeply, his head tilted back slightly, and made a sound that the translator rendered after a moment of processing as complex, deep, extraordinary. Chen Wei picked up the carving knife. He began to carve. There's a specific kind of skill to carving well-cooked pork. It wants to fall apart in some places and hold together in others, and knowing which is which, and how to work with that rather than against it, and Chen Wei had it. He carved efficiently and cleanly, and the pieces he laid out had a color that food scientists call the pink smoke ring, and that humans who know anything about grilling recognize immediately as a mark of real slow cooking. He served the humans first, plates, proper ones, the ones he'd brought out specifically for this. Then he paused. He looked at General Vorax. He said, the Vorakan don't process proteins. I know that. I'm not going to offer you something your physiology doesn't accept or your culture doesn't permit. Vorax said nothing. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that this is a genuine question, not a challenge. Ask. Is there something you would want to eat on a day like today? Among, he gestured at the assembled beings, among what has become, I hope, at least something approaching a shared table. The silence lasted longer than any other silence that day. Vorax looked at Chen Wei. He looked at the food. He looked at his delegation, and something passed between them, subsonic, too low for my earpiece to catch. And Subcommander Teth made a small gesture that the cultural assessor wrote about for 2 pages. Then General Vorax said, At home, before a campaign, the general eats. The entire command eats, together. Not from the same kill. Vorakin protocols do not allow cross-consumption of prey resources, but at the same time in the same space. It is called Veth Kal Armir. The translator struggled. It settled on the feast before the frontier. It is not a soft tradition, Vorak said. It is ancient. The general eats with those who will fight beside him because, he paused, because it tells them something true about their commander, that he has what they need to face what comes. Chen Wei nodded slowly. Is there something your delegation would eat? Vorax looked at Teth. Teth said something subsonic. Vorax said, we have provisions on the vessel. Could they be brought here? Another look between them, another subsonic exchange. They could. Then let them be brought, Chen Wei said, and we'll eat together, not from the same source, at the same table. And whatever it means to your tradition, I'm willing to call it the same thing it means to mine. The Vorakin provisions arrived 20 minutes later. I'm not going to describe what the Vorakin eat, because it's in the xenobiological record, and also because I watched them eat it and I am a professional, but I am also a human being, and there are limits to my detachment. What I will say is that it was clearly fresh, clearly significant to them in some ritual sense, and that when they consumed it, sitting at the far end of the table from the humans, in the early evening light of an Earth coastal summer, there was something about the scene that I had not been trained for and had no prior reference point for. 18 beings, 2 species, eating, at the same table. The cultural assessor filled 3 full notation pages. Section 8. What VORAX said at the end. As the light went amber and the day moved toward its close, and the remains of the meal were being cleared, and the diplomatic teams were beginning the quiet work of transitioning from the informal to the formal, scheduling the next session, confirming communication protocols, all the practical machinery, General Vorax found me. Not Chen Wei, me. He came to where I was standing at the edge of the covered area, doing what I'd been doing all day, which was watching. He stopped near me. We were almost the same height, which was unusual because I'm not a small man, but I was standing on a slightly raised portion of the patio. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You were at Keth 7. Yes, General. You are security. Yes. You have been watching this entire day. It's my job." He was quiet for a moment. His patches were doing the warm amber, the non-threatening one. Then he said, "What is your assessment?" I thought about that for a moment. A Vorakin general was asking for my professional assessment of a diplomatic encounter. That was not a thing I had a protocol for. I said honestly, I think you came here expecting to learn something about human food culture. I think you're leaving having learned something about human strategy." The general was quiet. Continue. Feeding people is how we build things that last. Nations, alliances, families, trade networks. Every human structure that's survived more than a few generations has a meal at its center. The ambassador didn't bring a grill to Keth 7 because it was clever. He brought it because it's true, because it's what humans actually do. I paused. You can't fake that. You either do it or you don't. And when you do it, when the being across the table from you understands that you spent 8 hours preparing something for them, that you selected specific wood for the smoke and specific marinade for the flavor and brought them here and cooked in front of them and let them watch every step, they know they're not being managed. They know they're being. I looked for the word. Welcomed, I said. General Vorax was still for a long time. Then he said, "In 4,000 years of space travel, we have encountered 43 species capable of civilization. We have consumed 7. We have subordinated 35. 36, I said. according to the Keth-7 statement. 35 now, he said. One renegotiated their terms 18 months ago. We accepted. I looked at him. Because of Keth-7. He didn't answer directly. He said, when I returned from Keth-7, I made a report to the Vorakan Dominion High Command. I told them that the human species did not fit established contact classifications, that their response patterns indicated a form of social complexity we had not previously encountered in a species of their physical profile. What was the response? They asked me to assess the risk. And I told them the risk was not military, that the human military capacity, while developing, was not yet the primary strategic consideration. What was? Vorax looked at the grill, at the now dark coals cooling. I told them, he said, that a species capable of spending 800,000 years refining the process of sharing food, of investing that degree of creative and social energy into the simple act of eating together, was a species that understood something about survival that the Vorakan did not. He paused. I told them this species would outlast us if we consumed them, because you cannot consume something that spreads through contact, something that teaches, something that... He stopped. He was looking at the grill again. Something that makes even apex predators lean forward, I said. He looked at me. Something moved through his bioluminescent patches, a flicker, brief, gold warm. Yes, he said, something like that.